Good day, everyone. We will use the Australian greeting, both because we have a lot of Australians who will be speaking in the next few minutes, and it's appropriate for the many time zones we represent. I'm Mike Pratt, the chair of the Global Observatory for Physical Activity, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the science behind the second set of country cards put on by the Global Observatory for Physical Activity. And first, a big thank you to the International Society for Physical Activity and Health. GoPA is a council of ISPA, and thanks to Jasper, our president, and Tepi, our lead for communications, we are able to use this platform provided by ISPA for this webinar. So I'll say just a couple of words of introduction and then turn it over to our speakers. First, I want to remind everyone that the Global Observatory was a vision of Pedro Hallal's that came out of the first set of, came out of the first Lancet series for physical activity in 2012. And most of you probably know Andrea Ramirez from Colombia, who I think is the person singularly most responsible for turning that vision into the reality of the country cards and what the observatory has become. And she's really been not just a member of the network, but the person who has done the most work to make it happen. However, GoPA is a network, and it's a network of the country contacts, more than 150 of whom have provided the data which has allowed us to have the country cards 5 years ago, and then again in our recent launch. So it's really a grassroots network, and it is, I think, characterized by innovation and independence, and you will see that in the presentations on how the science, which has guided this set of country cards, was put together. And I think it's explicitly been demonstrated in the development of policy indicators, new sedentary behavior indicators, the country capacity pyramids, all of which are ideas which bubbled up out of the people working on GoPA. And then finally, a thank you to the steering committee, which has guided GoPA, a dozen experts in physical activity and public health from around the world. So it's a really cool combination of leading experts from around the world and country contacts from every country, and open to innovation, open to being driven by good science with a minimum of politics. And I will now turn it over to Dr. Andrea Ramirez to kick off our webinar for today.
Thank you, Mike. Good afternoon and good morning to everyone. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the methods we used for data collection for the second set of country cards. We have a lot of information, and we have been working for many years now to be able to get to this place. So we're very proud of our product. So I'm going to talk to you about the general indicators, surveillance and research indicators. So the first thing is I would like to acknowledge our country contacts and their country teams. We have over 162 country contacts and their teams working in GoPA, and they have done an outstanding work. It has been a lot of hard work, so we are very thankful to them. Also to our working group. Now we have, over the last years, we have grown, and we have a very strong working group now that has made possible that we collected all the information we did for the second set of country cards. So as you know, in 2014, we started operations as a global network. Obviously, in 2012, the GoPA and the observatory the idea of the observatory was created with the Lancet Series 1. But then in 2014 is the year when we started operations and thinking about what we were going to to collect and what our main product was going to be. So using a standardized methodology, we were able to collect data about physical activity health outcomes, surveillance, policy, and research indicators, and we put them in what we called the country cards. So we wanted to answer the question, what is the worldwide status of physical activity related surveillance, policy, and research at that time? So this is one of the main questions we address with the country cards. Obviously now we have more questions to answer. So most of you have seen our previous website. This is how it looked like. And in 2015, in December 2015, we were able to launch 139 country cards with standardized methods, and we were very happy about it. We launched the almanac, the printed version, in the Congress in Thailand with many of you with us at the moment. So we were very happy with the product. We were very happy with what we had achieved at the time. This is how a country card looked like at the moment. So this is the country card template for the first set of country cards. You can see here the main indicators that were about physical activity prevalence, deaths due to physical inactivity, surveillance and policy, and research. Obviously, you have here the English version and the translated version. This is the case for many of our country cards. So with this question in mind, about what is the worldwide status of physical activity, surveillance, policy, and research, we wanted to answer additional things. So we wanted to know how is this changing over time? We were thinking about what are we going to do next with the country cards and how is GoPA going to include more information? So we were interested in knowing how is this changing over the years and if we can add new indicators. So this is how we developed the methodology that we currently use for data collection and to be able to put together the country cards. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this methodology. Like in the launch webinar, I described 3 phases that are the second set of country cards planning, like really the country cards planning and the new sets of cards planning, preliminary country contacts approval and seek for new country contacts, and the last phase, which is finishing the country cards and launching that. So today I'm going to talk to you, and we are going to talk to you about phase 1, which is how we collected the data. So phase 1 for us is very important and probably is the phase that we're going to start again for the third set of country cards. So it is about the new set of cards planning, how the working groups are going to start working again, and obviously data collection with our standardized methods. So here, we're going to present you with these QR codes throughout the presentation so you can see the products that we published about most of our indicators. So in this first one, you will be able to find the paper that we published about the methods. So for the first phase, what you can see is that the working groups started to work and started to get better at thinking about which were the new indicators that we wanted to include, what was the data that we wanted to collect, and which were the questions that we wanted to answer with this new set of country cards. So you can see here that this is a process that started in 2017, when we met and think about what we wanted to achieve. Also, here you can see other meetings in 2018 and 2019, and you are familiar with most of these researchers, but it was actually a lot of work. And over 3 years, we were thinking about which are the indicators to include and which was the data we wanted to collect. So thanks to them too. So having in mind this first country card, we wanted to include more detailed indicators. So we thought it was very important to include more detailed policy indicators. We wanted to include new research metrics. We wanted to assess the national capacity to promote physical activity. And we just had conducted, as Deborah is going to mention later, a pyramid and a conceptual framework which we were going to use to assess and determine that. We wanted to include sedentary time indicators, and obviously we needed a new country card template to be able to fit all this new information. So this is kind of what we achieved in March last year, but this is just for you to see that the template changed a lot. And just like with the first template that we developed in 2014, for this template of the second set of country cards, we had multiple rounds to adjust and to consult with the public about their ideas and their suggestions for this new template. So in the right, you can see how the new country card looks like, and you can compare it to the first country card. You can see we have many more information and indicators. So I'm going to go like to make an overview of the data collection methods that we always use. So we have data sources that we use over time. We have a specific country identification and classification system. And obviously we develop the indicators based on the recommendations from the working group's experts. So the first thing is that we use multiple data sources. Obviously, we consult secondary data sources like the World Health Organization, Global Health Observatory repository, the World Bank, our World in Data website, United Nations, and obviously papers and the Lancet series that are about global physical activity and health. In terms of country identification and classification, so we put together the list of the World Bank and the World Health Organization. We came up with a list of 2015 countries, and then according to the country contacts recommendations, we divided the UK into its 4 countries. We merged China and Taiwan as the Greater China Area, Palestine and West Bank, and Gaza. In terms of region classification, we have both regions classification. So we have the WHO regional offices and also the World Bank classification. In terms of income, we have the World Bank income categories. So here in the country card in the right, you will be able to see where the country-specific general information is located in the country cards. In the left, a little bit smaller, you can see where is that description available in the general and the detailed appendix, as I mentioned in the launch. So what you can see here is that we use the same data sources for all the country cards, and obviously the country contacts are able to provide us with more updated or different data sources, but most of the cards use the same data sources for the general country information. In terms of national estimates of physical activity prevalence, so you can see here in the Scotland card where the new indicator is located. And what we do is that we use the data in this second set of country cards from the Global Health Observatory data repository, and we used the WHO standard population estimate that is included in Regina Goodsholt Lancet paper. So we use the physical inactivity estimate from this paper, and then we change it into physical activity prevalence. Another data source is national surveys. So the country contacts are allowed to propose a new data source for physical activity prevalence, but I will show you some of the conditions that we require in order to be able to do this. So as I was mentioning, in GoPA, we present physical activity prevalence instead of insufficient physical activity. So we estimate this as 100 minus the prevalence of insufficient physical activity, that is age standardized up to 2016. you will be able to see that the country cards that use this data source have here the reference just below the indicators. And if a country contact suggests a different data source, we will allow it if it meets the physical activity definition. So up to November 2020, because now we know it's kind of different. But at the moment, and all the second set of country cards meet this definition if we use different data sources. So meeting the physical activity recommendation, defined as 150 minutes a week of moderate intensity or 75 minutes a week of vigorous intensity physical activity or an equivalent combination. The country has to use instruments like the GPAC or the IPAC, and then we require that the country contact sends us the reference and proof that this is national or subnational representativeness. You will see here below the actual physical activity estimate, the reference again, if we have a different data source. In terms of data attributable to physical inactivity, what we did was to use the Lancet Physical Activity Series 1 list paper, but also we did a new estimation based on a recommendation on using this equation of the semi-adjusted population attributable fraction. So we use this equation, we use the new physical activity prevalence, and we use the relative risk corresponding to list paper from the Lancet series 2012. In terms of surveillance, what we do, the physical activity prevalence, the deaths due to physical inactivity, and the physical activity surveillance are similar, and the data collection is very similar to what we did for the first set of country cards, and these indicators didn't change. So it's the same indicator with different data sources, but the indicator was kept the same. The definition for physical activity surveillance is a national survey defined as a survey conducted with a national or subnational representative sample, and that included physical activity questions. What you will see is that we conducted different and multiple online databases and sites searches in order to come up with the name of these surveys and the years of these surveys. We have specific search terms that you can see in the detailed appendix, and this is how we came up not only with the years of the surveys, but also the names and the instruments, which is something new that we're including now in the country cards. We have these categories for surveillance. So we have that the country doesn't have national surveillance that includes physical activity, that the country has one survey that includes physical activity, and if it's the first, what's the year, that the country has two national surveys that include physical activity, or three or more national surveys that include physical activity. We have also if the country has national recommendations or guidelines, and if there's a national monitoring system, including physical activity or sedentary behavior. Again, this indicator is very similar to the original one. The new and the additional information is the name and the years of the surveys, if the country has national recommendations, and if the country has national monitoring system, including physical activity or sedentary behavior. In terms of research, we wanted to produce a more accurate and detailed estimate for research, and we kept thinking about the possibility of including information since the start of research in the field until 2019, for example. So we came up with a different way to collect this information, which is actually what I'm going to show you after this slide. But this indicator is very important because we know that local, regional, and global scientific production and research capacity are important strategies for improving public health policies and programs. And also because what we found with the first set of country cards and what was found in the Lancet Physical Activity series in 2012 was quite shocking, because very unequal distributions of research productivity were found. So we wanted to advocate for improving research capacity worldwide, so we could understand how this information is being translated into policies and interventions. So we conducted a systematic search, a systematic review. You can see it here. You can scan the QR code using PubMed, Scopus, Easy Web of Knowledge. And what we did was to include and to look for all the papers, peer-reviewed papers about physical activity since the 1950s up to the 2019. So this was a really big systematic search, systematic review. So we put together a team of 10 researchers. It took us 3 years to finish this project. But then we were able to get an estimate of the entire output, or at least an approximation of the research output in all of the countries in GoPA. So you can look at the paper to look for the detailed methods, but then we scanned over 500,000 articles, and then we selected 23,860 articles that were included and classified by regions and study types and decades. So in the end, we were able to come up with this physical activity research indicators. So we have total number of articles per country from 1950 to 2019. Also, we have the contribution of the country to physical activity research worldwide from the 1950s to 2019. And we also categorized these as quintiles. So you will find here the contribution, you will find here the total number of articles, and you will find here where is this country located in terms of quintiles of research productivity. So this is one of the additions to the country cards. Thank you. Bojana and Zeljko.
Greetings from the GoPA TV studio Melbourne, where we are in day 4 of a snap COVID-19 lockdown. It is 6:30 in the morning and you're watching GoPA Breaking News with Zeljko Pedisic, otherwise known as Zeljko Pedisic. Today's breaking news. The number of COVID cases globally is still on the rise. The Global Observatory for Physical Activity issued a new set of country cards. The weather today will be partially cloudy with 30% chance of rain and possible thunderstorms, and with a maximum of 21 degrees Celsius, perfect conditions for staying at home and attending a Zoom webinar. But let's start with the report from our political correspondent, Dr. Bojana Klepac Pogrmilovic, joining us live from Melbourne. Today, she will talk about GoPA policy research and the development of a new GoPA policy indicator. Bojana, in 2018, you published a systematic review of studies analyzing national physical activity policies. Please tell us more about the study.
Thank you, Zeljko. Andrea, please slide 17. In this study, we screened more than 25,000 references in 6 bibliographic databases, and we found 203 studies on national physical activity and sedentary behavior policies. In the paper, we summarized research findings for 168 countries, and in a supplementary document, we listed key findings for each country separately. We found limited research on sedentary behavior policies and scarce evidence on low and middle income countries. We also found that very few studies explicitly stated what they considered to be a physical activity policy. And among those studies that did define policy, the definitions were largely inconsistent. Also, we found that very few studies were based on a theoretical framework.
Thank you, Bojana. Very interesting findings indeed. Given there is no consensus in political science on what represents a policy, it is obviously very important to clearly define the object of policy analysis in each particular paper. In your subsequent paper, you developed a framework for a comprehensive analysis of physical activity policy, also known as GoPA framework. Could you briefly present the framework to our viewers?
Slide 35, please. The GoPA framework was based on an extensive literature review, 3 rounds of Delphi decisional process, and 2 rounds of consultations with policy researchers and other stakeholders. As a part of the framework, we provided definitions of physical activity policy and physical activity policy analysis. We also identified and defined 38 elements of a comprehensive analysis of physical activity policy. Next slide, please. So our expert team agreed that physical activity policy is indicated by the totality of formal written policies, unwritten formal statements, written standards and guidelines, formal procedures, and informal policies that may directly or indirectly affect community or population level physical activity. Next slide, please. As you can see on the screen, the 38 elements of GoPA framework are grouped in 6 building blocks. These include purpose of analysis, policy level, policy sector, type of policy, stage of policy cycle, and scope of analysis.
Thank you, Bojana. Research suggests that both physical activity and sedentary behavior are among the key behavioral risk factors for chronic disease. Is GoPA framework also applicable to sedentary behavior policies?
Yes, absolutely. GoPA framework can also be used to guide research on sedentary behavior policies.
Thank you. I know you used this framework to guide your recent assessment of instruments for the analysis of physical activity policies. What were the key findings of that review?
Slide 74, please. In our systematic literature search, we found 16 instruments for the analysis of physical activity and sedentary behavior policies. Their detailed assessment revealed that several instruments of GoPA framework were underrepresented in the instruments. But it is important to mention that using comprehensive instruments for physical activity policy analysis may not always be the best choice. They may be very time-consuming, and for some purposes, it may be more suitable to use less comprehensive tools.
In this review paper, Bojana, what was your assessment of the original GoPA policy indicator that was used in the country cards published in 2015?
Well, I will show the indicator on the screen. So, Andrea, please slide 21. GoPA originally used a very simple questionnaire to collect data on physical activity policy, as Andrea mentioned in her presentation earlier. It talked about the availability of national physical activity policies and surveys, and whether the policy was standalone or part of a non-communicable disease policy.
This questionnaire obviously allowed to collect data on only a few elements specified in the GoPA framework. Was that the reason why GoPA recently developed a new policy inventory?
Yes, slide 135, please. The current GoPA policy inventory was developed in 3 stages. The first version of the inventory was based on the Health Enhancing Physical Activity Policy Audit tool, and it was pilot tested in 14 countries. The development of the second version of the inventory was additionally informed by the GoPA framework and also by the monitoring framework from the European Union recommendation on health enhancing physical activity across sectors. And the development of this version also included several discussions among experts in the field. This tool was then updated based on pilot testing and consultations with 10 GoPA country contexts, which then resulted in the final version of the GoPA policy inventory, version 3. Next slide, please. The inventory includes 20 items for auditing and assessment of physical activity and sedentary behavior policies. They ask about availability, comprehensiveness, implementation, and effectiveness of policies. They also ask about formal written policies, recommendations, national targets, surveillance and monitoring, and actors in the policy process.
Thank you, Bojana. I realized that not all the data from the policy inventory are included in the recently published GoPA country cards. Could you explain to our viewers why is that the case?
Andrea, please, slide 22. On your screen, you can see the new GoPA policy indicator. It only includes the key information collected using the GoPA policy inventory. As you can see, the questions on the availability of national physical activity policy and surveys remained the same. This was important to enable comparisons with the finding of previous country cards. The newly added indicators are the availability of national recommendations and health surveillance and monitoring system that includes measures of physical activity and sedentary behavior. Other data collected using the GoPA policy inventory will be made publicly available through additional GoPA reports and journal articles.
Thank you. Have some of these data already been published?
Slide 85, please, Andrea. Yes. Preliminary findings on national physical activity and sedentary behavior policies in 76 countries have been published last year in the International Journal of Behavioral Nutrition and Physical Activity. In this article that you can see on the screen, we presented data from all 20 items of the GoPA policy inventory. We found that most of these 76 countries had physical activity policies, but we found that their comprehensiveness, implementation, and effectiveness could be significantly improved. Compared to physical activity policies, sedentary behavior policies seem to be less available, less comprehensive, less implemented, and less effective. But as I said, these are only preliminary findings from 76 countries. Summary findings for the final sample of 162 countries are, of course, available in the new GoPA country cards, proudly presented on the new GoPA website.
Thank you, Dr. Bojana Klepac-Pogrmilovic, for this thorough and interesting report. For more information about GoPA policy indicators, please visit www.new.globalphysicalactivityobservatory.com or call 6300 7575. This has been GoPA Breaking News. I am Zeljko Pedisic, and with us today we had Dr. Bojana Klepac-Pogrmilovic. Wishing you all a COVID-safe day, and stay tuned.
Wow, I do not know how to follow that. That was fantastic. So yes, I will do my best to follow that. So my name's Tepi Mclaughin, and today I'm with Dr. Andrew Atkin, and we're here to talk about the sitting time indicator added to the second set of Global Observatory country cards. Next slide, please. So the first edition of country cards was launched back in 2015, but since 2015, we know that a lot of physical activity research has accumulated, and this has affirmed the health benefits of all intensities of movement. Within that, sedentary behavior has received increased attention, either as a distinct health behavior or as an integral component of daily time use. Including sedentary behavior metrics on the second set of country cards reflects the maturing evidence and discourse in the field. Back in 2016, the Sedentary Behavior Council of the International Society for Physical Activity and Health was launched, and with its mission to advance the science, advocacy, and practice relating to sedentary behavior and health. Later in 2016, with the goal of adding sedentary behavior metrics to the second edition of the GoPA cards, the Sedentary Behavior Global Monitoring Initiative was established as a collaborative partnership between the Sedentary Behavior Council and GoPA. 4 years on, and after a lot of work and following contributions from a really global team of over 30 ISPAR members, it's exciting that we can bring the abridged version of our methods and results And then Andy will go on to talk about a discussion for the future and current limitations. Next slide, please. So we wanted to decide the two most appropriate sedentary behavior metrics to include within the cards, and this is where we've landed. Total daily sitting time in hours per day and daily sitting time global tertiles. And this was established following pilot work in 2017 with some European data. Sitting time was deemed the most appropriate sedentary behavior metric for a few reasons, including the underpinning epidemiological evidence linking it to negative health effects, but also its simplicity to interpret in hours per day and the wider availability of the country level data compared with other sedentary behavior metrics. Next slide, please. So for our methods, we had a 6-stage methods that we worked through, and this was quite an extensive search carried out by over 25 ISPAR members in 4 stages. This first 4 stages. So 2 additional search stages were carried out by the core team, stages 5 and 6. And these were to review the original country cards, to conduct some searches in Medline, to conduct some searches of the Demographic and Health Survey website, also to search Google. And then for stages 5 and 6, conducted by the core team, specific searches of the stepwise approach to surveillance, the STEPS WHO website, and also extracting the data directly from the Eurobarometer 88.4, the most recent Eurobarometer data. What we did was, if we found that a country had 2 or more sets of data in the last 10 years, what we did was we ranked them hierarchically based on sample representativeness first. So we placed priority on studies where the sampling procedure was intended to provide data representative of the whole country. After that, we prioritized based on recency of the year of data collection. So that's a very abridged version of the methods. The next slide has the publication of that data set and those methods. So I encourage, if you'd like to read that, you can scan the QR code there for a plain language summary initially, and then you can click on the button at the bottom of that page to go and read the full article published in the International Journal of Behavioral Nutrition and Physical Activity. So the next slide. Following that paper, we built on our methods by introducing the GoPA country contacts. So we started with 62 countries that had data on sitting time in our paper. From there, we sent that data to country contacts as part of the GoPA process for approval. Country contacts either approved the use of the data, provided new data, updated data, or provided data where we had not identified previous data. We then had this process of slightly loosening of our methodology to include multi-item questionnaires, whereas our original methodology focused on single item. So here's a brief overview of our results in the next slide. So we started with 62 countries, and with an extra 15 countries identified by the country contacts, we landed on 77 of the 217 countries included in GoPA of having sitting time data. And we're really proud of getting up to 77. As you can see, unfortunately, the majority of the data comes from higher income countries, 60% high income and 19% upper middle income. And all but 2 countries use single item self-report, despite loosening our methodology following the publication of the paper. Next slide, please. This was the range of daily sitting time in hours. So as you can see, quite a large range, 2.2 hours in the lowest country through to 9.9 hours in the highest country. And the overall mean sitting time was 4.6 hours, representing quite a low value. And that's probably because we know that single item self-report questionnaires for sitting time have been found to underestimate sitting time by around about 2 hours. Next slide, please. So our results showed a little bit of an increase as you go from low and low and middle income countries to upper and high income countries. So, and that was reflected in our paper as well, and with the additional data here. Next slide, please, which is just an overview of where you'll be able to find the data on the country cards. Here's an example from Saudi Arabia. So you'll find both the total sitting time in hours per day, but also the tertile, which ranks the sitting time as high, medium, and low, high being the highest amount of sedentary time, sitting time, sorry. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Andy to take the rest of the presentation.
Great stuff. Thank you, Tepi. Slide, please, Andrea. Okay, so there's an opportunity now, I think, for us to reflect on some of the limitations of the data that we've identified, and some reflections on our process and thoughts about where we might go in the future. So Tepi's done a great job of providing an overview there of the data that we identified. We located sitting time information for 77 countries to be included on the revised country cards, but that reflects only around 35% of the 217 countries that we start from in terms of conducting our searches. So there's still quite limited global coverage at present with regard to sitting time surveillance. And as Tepi illustrated, that's quite heavily skewed towards high income countries. We are still solely reliant on questionnaire-based assessment to capture sitting time, predominantly single item questionnaires. And as Tepi noted, we recognize, it's widely recognized that single item questionnaires typically tend to underestimate daily sitting time in the region of about 2 hours. In some cases, in a similar manner to the physical activity prevalence estimate, not all of the data sources that we draw from for our sitting time estimates are nationally representative. In some cases, we draw on what WHO would term subnational samples for where we've derived our sitting time estimates. So I think they are the key limitations that show where we could go in future in terms of surveillance of sitting time and broadening the reach of sitting time assessment globally. Next slide, please, Andrea. Thank you. So our challenges here of methodology mirror many of the challenges that are evident on the physical activity side of things as well. There's clearly some challenges of comparability, of harmonization of sitting time estimates that are derived from single versus multi-item questionnaires, and in some cases our estimates haven't taken account of sample or survey weighting dependent upon the underlying methodology of the source of the study where the estimates are drawn from. Andrea, next slide. Thank you. So we're very proud to have got this far with incorporating sitting time estimates into the country cards, and it's been a really valuable collaboration between the Sedentary Behaviour Council and GoPA, and having now reached this milestone, it's an opportunity for us to kind of reflect and look ahead and think about how we might move things forward. There may be scope in future for us to think about how we might align the sedentary behaviour metrics with the physical activity metrics, particularly with regard to prevalence. In a number of cases, our sitting time estimates are derived from different surveillance tools, different sources from the physical activity prevalence estimates. So there may be opportunity to try and align these two indicators there in the future. as we've alluded to already, we know that many of our sitting time questionnaires, our single item instruments are systematically underestimating total daily sitting time. So there may be scope there where we can incorporate some measurement error correction methods in order to try and take our source data, apply some corrections so that they're providing estimates that might be more accurate, more realistic, aligned to what we've seen when we've used device-based measurements of sitting time. And looking ahead, there also may be scope for the addition of further metrics to the cards related to sedentary behaviour. We'll all be aware that the behavioural epidemiology field has opened up, has become broader in its perspective over the last few years. Much more work now taking a 24-hour perspective on time use, health behaviours. And so there may be an opportunity there to draw sleep into the country cards as an additional metric. And there's also scope to expand the upstream or policy-related metrics with regard to sedentary behaviour, which and perhaps to try and bring those in closer alignment to the physical activity metrics on that topic. Slide, please. Okay, so very briefly then, just to finish, as Tepi alluded to, this was a big team effort, drawing widely from the ISPA membership. So the project as a whole was led predominantly by Tepi, with contributions from myself and Katrine Veindiler and Bridget Lynch as co-chairs of the Sedentary Behaviour Council. Over 20 members of ISPA contributed to locating data sources, screening data sources as the working group. So we're very grateful for everyone for giving up their time and making this happen. And then, of course, we're very grateful for the leadership of GoPA and for working with us to put these cards together, incorporate sedentary behaviour into them. And I think there is one final slide there of references, and I will hand over there. Thank you.
Hey everyone. Thank you for joining today, and thank you for staying on. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a new indicator that we developed for this set of new GoPA country cards, which is the Physical Activity Promotion Capacity Pyramid Indicator. Next slide, please. So to give you a little bit of background, this indicator came about when working together with Andrea, we were thinking of a way in which we could summarize in a meaningful way, and in a way that is meaningful both for research but also for practice and policy, summarize a country's capacity for physical activity promotion, and in a way in which we could integrate these three pillars of research, surveillance, and policy. So what we realized is, going back to this other paper, in which I wasn't the direct part of, but which was sort of the starting point for everything GoPA in the literature, something important that Andrea and colleagues found back then in this paper is a strong correlation between indicators for research capacity, surveillance capacity, and policy capacity across countries, meaning countries that tend to have high research capacity may have also high surveillance capacity and high policy capacity, and vice versa. Obviously, this isn't perfect, but the three variables seem to be correlated with each other. So this told us, or suggested us, that potentially improvements in one of these streams or pillars for physical activity promotion at the country level could then trigger improvements in the other indicators and vice versa. And also having one of these pillars as a weaker point may in fact be pulling the others to down. So in an ideal scenario, we'd want a country to have strong research capacity, policy capacity, and surveillance capacity for physical activity. What we also found was that together, each of these were associated with higher population levels of physical activity at the country level. So next slide, please. So when thinking of this new analysis that we were conducting using the original GoPA country cards and following that first paper by Andrea, Ramirez, and colleagues, we decided to more formally develop this idea of a conceptual model for country capacity for physical activity promotion, integrating these three pillars, because we are convinced that when you have sort of this magical alliance of these three indicators being at a high level in a country, you are much more prone to have active populations. So what we did here, we essentially went back to the data from the first set of country cards, and we determined what we would use, which sort of cut points or thresholds we would use to determine that a country could be classified as having either high, medium, or low capacity for research, for surveillance, or for policy, as shown in the figure right here in the center of your slide. So this figure is published as part of this follow-up paper that we developed. And I think an important piece of this figure is really sort of showing how each country could visualize themselves in terms of, well, maybe you have high capacity for one of these pillars, but not from the other one. So this sort of cheat sheet that's shown on the right-hand side of your slide, I think what was one of the most important contributions of our paper in showing things by stages, not as something that's static and that if you have low capacity, that's how you're going to stay. But we are trying to portray the message that this is all part of a development in which countries hopefully move from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3, and that the improvements observed across these three pillars, research, surveillance, and policy, will hopefully be easily traceable to improvements in population levels of physical activity across these countries. So in our paper, we have examples of different countries with their actual data to show how they were rated in terms of their capacity for physical activity promotion in terms of these three pillars. And as you can see, stage 2 is, I guess, the messiest one. We discussed back when we were putting together this pyramid and the way in which we could summarize the evidence that comes out of this indicator, if we needed to break up stage 2 really in different stages, depending on how countries were faring. But we decided to just leave it anything intermediate that goes between having essentially everything in red, which means low capacity, and everything in green, which means high capacity for each. So everything in between, we would call it a stage 2. This was an interesting discussion that we had with the group of authors of this paper. And I think is something that we always need to keep in mind, especially when thinking of public health and this intersection between research and practice, and especially for instruments like the country cards, which can help us understand things about the global promotion of physical activity and global status of physical activity, research, surveillance, and policy as a research question in itself, but then also as a tool to ignite change, and hopefully for the better, right? So the discussion here led to the point that we don't want to break stage 2 up into so many different stages that it would be somewhat, demoralizing to countries for which having any sort of improvement, moving from a red to a yellow in any of these three areas probably took a lot of effort from the policy standpoint, research standpoint, or surveillance standpoint. So we would consider them as being in stage 2, being in that transition period between being a country with low capacity and a country with high capacity. for physical activity promotion. And I think that was an important decision, and it seems to be working in the right way. Next slide, please. So here's just an example of one of the country cards. This is Colombia's country card to show the placing in the card, where we are now showing this pyramid indicator for physical activity promotion capacity at the country level. Next slide, please. And sort of the cheat sheet that goes along with this, which was important to publish to, was, what do all of these colors mean? So in green, we are showing for the policy component, it means that the country has a standalone physical activity plan or policy. Now, this is an interesting change that happened between what was published in the scientific manuscript, which we'll give you the reference for at the end of this presentation, and what ended up happening in practice when bringing the indicator to the country cards. So this was sort of a follow-up discussion that happened and that I think was important. In our original conception of how we would rate high capacity for policy, we had said that high capacity would refer to having both a standalone physical activity plan or policy at the national level and having good implementation of it. Now, we realized when we were collecting data for the second set of country cards that collecting good, reliable, valid data on policy implementation is very difficult. And we wouldn't be able to be truthful in saying that we have high quality data that tells us about the quality and quantity of implementation going on, of policy implementation. So this was something that was just not possible at this stage. We are working on a policy tool that down the line can allow us to determine the levels of policy implementation that are actually occurring. But right now, we realized that all the information we had would only be reflective of the policy existing itself, not of whether it is being implemented or not. So that led us to adjust our rankings. So we determined that for high policy capacity, we would call that that a country had high policy capacity if they had the standalone plan or policy at the national level, regardless of implementation. And therefore, we shifted sort of the medium levels and the low levels to say the medium level was that the country had any sort of non-communicable disease plan or obesity plan or any other health-related plan, which included in a prominent way physical activity, but it wasn't a standalone plan. In our original proposal for this conceptual model as published, we had said that the medium level would be having a standalone physical activity plan, but no implementation. So there was a shift here. And this was based on the data available for us to classify countries as having high, medium, and low capacity, only based on the availability of a policy with no information on implementation levels. So here, as you can see on this slide, the low capacity for policy refers to a country not having a physical activity plan or policy, including the fact that there is no NCD policy or obesity national policy that prominently includes physical activity as a key component. In terms of surveillance, high surveillance capacity was defined as the country having periodic physical activity surveillance. So both including data for a first national survey on physical activity, data on what the most recent are, and also including information on when the next data collection period for national surveillance and physical activity would take place. So this was an important thing because there's a lot of countries that have some level of national levels of physical activity data, but there's not really a process in place and an infrastructure to sustain periodic data collection, which is sort of the definition of a surveillance system, right? Otherwise, we just have a cross-section at some point in time and nothing else follows. In the medium level for surveillance, we have countries that have some type of physical activity surveillance, meaning that there is more than one survey that has taken place, and that data are somewhat comparable across surveys, but there's not a clear indication of periodicity. going on. So we don't really know when the next survey will take place. And again, low capacity just means that there's no surveillance. There's not even data for one time. And then finally, with research, what we did here was we divided research output, research productivity based on the systematic review that was previously presented by Andrea. We classified this based on quintiles of research productivity, and essentially countries that were ranked in quintiles 1 and 2 for number of articles published are categorized as having high research productivity or high research capacity. Those that are ranked in quintiles 3 and 4 are ranked as having medium research capacity, and those are ranked in quintile 5 are ranked as having low research capacity. Next slide, please. And so with this, I'll end my presentation, just to say that if you scan this QR code or look up our paper, you will find much more details about the methods that were behind the rules sort of to classify countries in terms of their high, medium, and low capacity for these 3 pillars of physical activity promotion at the country level. I appreciate your invitation to present this sort of the rationale for this indicator today, as I think it is important. Sometimes I see in other fields these types of indicators, which are useful nonetheless, but they're not always grounded in actual data and previous evidence. And I do want to stress that the fact that we selected these 3 sort of main topics, policy, research, and surveillance, as what we call the pillars for physical activity promotion at the national level, is because we had evidence that they are tend to be highly correlated one with the other in countries, and B, that together they are highly correlated with levels of physical activity at the national level. And this tells us that we developed a valid indicator, and that hopefully can have meaningful impact, not just as we use the sets of cards themselves as a surveillance tool to see how these indicators move, hopefully in the right direction over time across different countries of the world, but also, again, to ignite policy change, to take these to our policymakers or to the entities in charge of sponsoring research in countries or of leading health surveillance systems, so that all countries of the world hopefully can rise to this high levels, and we can have a good amount of physical activity promotion happening at the country level worldwide. So I'll end at this. Thank you for the opportunity to present.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you, Tepi and Bo and Zeljko for this, and Andy for these wonderful presentations. Mike, are you there? Can you hear us? Okay, well, Mike is back. We're going to listen now to our discussion.
I've had some internet. Yeah, let's turn it over to, I think we'll start with Pedro, and then have additional comments from Adrian and Jasper.
Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here, and it will be very hard to do an interesting talk after our breaking news participation. But anyway, I will try to do my best. So I will be very quick, and I will focus on 3 things, and only one of them is about the data that was just presented. So I will start with that one. When I look at the research indicator, it is now comprehensive because it includes publications from 1950 onwards, but my comment is that it is too stable. So we need in the next set of cards to have an indicator that will show improvements in a given country as compared to today. So we can keep the 50, like the 70 years indicator, but we should have a more recent indicator of publication so that we know whether that country is progressing or not in the recent past. Otherwise, it will take like 10 years for a country to get much better. So that's my only comment about the indicators per se. My two major comments are about funding and communications. And I think we need to concentrate on those things. So first of all, I think everyone here must know that this work is pretty much done with no funding at all. And when I was the coordinator, funding came from my projects at the Federal University of Pelotas in Brazil. Now Mike Pratt is dealing with the funds, and then other colleagues help with small amounts of funds. But realistically, a project as big as GoPA needs core, serious funding. And it's a job for all of us here to think about possible alternatives. We need to find like a decent continuous funding for this project. And I just challenge everyone here to think about possibilities, and your inputs would be needed. Because, you know, then we go to the second comment about communication and policy. You know, GoPA was built to be an advocacy tool, to be a platform for changing physical activity, surveillance policy, and research worldwide. So it's more than writing our papers, publishing the cards, and all these things. So we need to make an impact. And in order to do that, we need to have a much stronger communication team. And this goes back to the funding thing. We need to schedule meetings, and some of them will be face-to-face after the pandemic. But you know, our country contacts, they need to find or to have a time with their ministers of health, or with prime ministers, or with presidents, realistically, to present the findings of their country cards. And we need these country cards to be widely used. And these country cards need to be shown to the media. And we need to do that in as many countries as we can. So I think our top priorities for the near future will be improving our communication. We have done a great job in everything. So now it's time to improve our communication and our capacity to influence governments on their decisions, and also to secure long-term funding for the projects. But my last 30 seconds, I will just use to congratulate the entire team and all the presenters, because this represents, you know, massive work from many people. And realistically, GoPA is one of the most important projects in the physical activity and health field nowadays. So well done, everyone. It was great to take part. And now I will let Adrian Bauman provide his insights on all these. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure to watch the evolution of GoPA over the last 5 or 6 years. It really is something that is in development. GoPA does not have a final identity, but it is an independent non-government organization and not-for-profit, which really is functioning as the conscience of physical activity. It's an informal group, which means it can say things that governments can't, even that ISPA can't, because ISPA is the formal organization for physical activity and health. But GoPA is part of ISPA, which is a very strategic positioning bilaterally. There are international advocacy NGOs, non-government organizations for tobacco and obesity, but there hasn't been one for physical activity. And when we think about the World Health Organization role, GAPA focuses on country-level actions, focusing on governments via their country representatives. GoPA is an independent organization which is coordinating international action and advocacy independent of governments, but working with the common agenda. As Pedro mentioned, it's unfunded, which means it really is an indication of the volunteers who contribute and international cooperation to address physical activity, to influence the physical activity agenda from an advocacy perspective. Really, we need to make a lot more of, for example, countries without a physical activity plan. In other words, they have no direction. Even if they have a physical activity prevalence estimate, we need to make more of that in the ways that Pedro suggested with a communication strategy. We may even need to write policy informing briefs, which are brief reports for policymakers, not for scientific publication, showing that GoPA is synthesizing a policy framework to indicate progress. We hope to gently and quietly embarrass some countries into stimulating action. That's what Deborah Salvo suggested we should do. We are nudging countries into thinking about making changes gradually, which is going to matter. And fundamentally, the next step, which Deborah mentioned, is advocacy for implementation, not just having a plan. And that's going to be the next, one of the next big steps of GoPA. It's a pleasure to be involved in an advocacy movement for physical activity. We haven't had one globally, and maybe GoPA is growing into that role. And I'm watching it and engaging with it with just sheer pleasure and delight for the work that's gone into it from the coordinating team and from all the country representatives. Thank you. I'll pass on back to Mike.
And we have one more discussant. I will turn it over to Jasper, our current ISPA president.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you very much to Andrea for organizing this, and obviously all the speakers. And I must say that the more I learn about the country cards, the more in awe I am about the amount of work that lies behind the country cards. It's really amazing to see how much has been done, also how much has been done since the first set of country cards that already were amazing. But there's so much more has been done to the second set of country cards. We've heard about all the new methodological improvements that have been made this time around, the new tools that have been developed to make this possible. It's really amazing to see all that innovation happening here. And I think as Pedro and Adrian were also hinting at, one of the things that fascinates me very much is to think about, okay, so what is the next step? How can we use this great resource that the country cards are? How can we use it more actively? How can we use it to become the advocacy organization that Adrian was hinting at? Or how can we use it to help convince governments, local authorities, national authorities to actually take action? I think that are some of the questions that we need to think about. I saw in the questions and also in the chat a great suggestion from Vicky Lambert, how we can use the cards more actively. And I think that is one of the things we together need to work on more. Apart, obviously, as Pedro was mentioning, thinking about funding, which might be something where ISPA can help a little bit moving forward. With that, I don't think I want to say much more, and I think I'll hand back to Mike to have a general discussion. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Jasper, Adrian and Pedro, for your comments. And I think we should start the discussion off with answers to some of the questions that have come up in the Q&A and the chat. And while I had some gaps in internet connectivity, I'll start by identifying three of the questions and suggesting where we might start. Karen Milton had a question about development of sedentary indicators. And I think that one is best directed to Tepi and Andrew. And while they're looking at that one and starting to gather themselves for the answer, let's say we have a second question from Joseph in the Czech Republic on sort of the meaning and the concentration of the research indicators in smaller countries or lower capacity countries. I think that question goes to Andrea. And then we have a question from Sylvia Teitz in Austria around how we make sense of PA prevalence comparisons given the limitations of the questionnaires we have. And a number of us can take that one on. But I'll turn it over to the sedentary behavior team first.
I'll perhaps go first and then Andy can add. So the question from Karen Milton was, many countries use the same or similar tools to assess physical activity. And it seems that for sedentary behavior, the tools are more variable. And basically asking how comparable are the prevalence estimates and how do better standardized surveillance methods or tools, how do we standardize surveillance methods and tools for sedentary behavior? So I did type up a quick answer in the method, so I'll just kind of draw on that. The majority of countries, and that was 75 of 77, either use the GPAC or the IPAC. In either, some countries used a small variation to the GPAC or IPAC, and they're both single item self-reports. The only two countries that we included on the cards that didn't were Canada and England, both using multi-item questions. So I think there's quite a bit of discussion about how to standardize potentially in the future, or the potential of using multi-item questions for more cards. There's obviously a balance between validity and feasibility. So single item always seems to crop up as being a really feasible method of population surveillance. But in terms of standardizing, there might be options to apply a correction factor to the single item self-reports. And like I said before, possibility of using different tools in the future. And there's a little reference in there if people are interested in reading more from Prince and colleagues. Anything else to add to that, Andy?
No, I don't have anything particularly substantive to answer that. I think that's a good response. And I mean, I think in terms of your question, Karen, about kind of standardizing surveillance and with regard to sedentary behavior, I mean, I think, you know, probably the key message that comes out from the work that we've done on the country cards is that there's still relatively little surveillance globally around sitting time. We're around the 30% mark, 77 countries out of 217. So I think in the first instance, we should probably be focusing on feasibility and really broadening the coverage of sitting time estimates. And in that regard, I think that there's probably some merit in the short to medium term in sticking with this single item approach, generating more data through that, thinking about how we might analyze this data, if we could improve its accuracy in any way. But certainly, if we are to increase coverage, to fill in all of those blank spaces on those country cards that exist at the moment, then I think pursuing single item questionnaire measurement to begin with would be the way to go before we start introducing other methods which may have better validity, but are likely to be more logistically, more administratively complex. So that would be my view. Others may disagree, I'm sure.
Great, thanks Andrew and Tepi. Let's turn it over to Andrea for Joseph's question around sort of interpreting country level capacity, particularly in countries that may just have, smaller countries that may really just have one research center, which is all of the capacity in that country.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks, Joseph, for the question. Well, actually, low and middle income countries have most of their physical activity prevalence estimate data coming from the WHO STEPS repository and from Goodall's paper. Remember, we have 3 conditions in order for the country contact to request a change from this data source, which is the definition, that we meet the definition of meeting the guideline, also the instrument that is used, and also the representativeness. So in the case they cannot provide us with the documents that show these, the country will be left without the physical activity prevalence estimate, or we can keep the WHO prevalence estimate.
And if I can add to that from the research center perspective, I think that observation points out why it's so important to have multinational projects and global networking in physical activity, is that it empowers some of the smaller country research centers to be more effective and productive, because they get support not just from the relatively limited local resources, but from global. It's not a global effort. Brasal's leading paper in more detail at this issue around obesity prevention research in Latin America, and in larger countries, the capacity that you find in publications and research centers and research funding tends to represent the country. In smaller countries, it's really variable, because one significant research center can have a huge impact, and it's sort of, one might think of it, it's kind of random whether that research center happens to be in Guatemala or in Costa Rica, for a Central American example. And Deborah may have an additional comment on this.
No, I think that's it, Mike. I think that's good enough. I just want to go back to the question about the concentration of publications in a single center. Although it can be a problem for some countries, at least it is there. So I think that our goal always is to produce indicators that are easy to interpret. So we could have, in an in-depth analysis of a given country, we could, for example, calculate something like similar to a Gini index of publications in that country to see on how many groups the total publications are divided into. But that would be complicated for like an overall indicator to be available for all countries. So Joseph, I think we can do that for specific countries, but not as a full indicator to be in the cards, because it would be very complicated to do at the country level.
I would say Adrian and Pedro are probably the 2 people who might first make comments on Sylvia's question on difficulty, especially for lay people, in understanding why comparing PA prevalence rates that we have between countries is so challenging, and perhaps where we can go in the future on this to wrap in some of Luis Berrios's question.
Did you want an answer, Mike?
Yes, I'm throwing this one
Okay,
to you, Adrian, and then follow up.
The answer will take me 17 hours to explain simply. But briefly, there are different instruments. IPAC and GPAC give different prevalence estimates. Other surveys usually give lower prevalence estimates. And above all, there are differential response rates and differential amounts of selection bias in different population surveys, even though they're all meant to be representative, because in some countries it's very difficult to get population samples. So all of these things contribute to making the prevalence estimates more indicators and more trends over time within country of improvement. But They can be used among cognate countries, similar countries who have similar surveys and similar demographics for some broad comparisons, which is what I think GoPA might do.
Thanks, Adrian.
I think, Mike, my main thing is that GoPA, differently from several articles that we have written in the past, for GoPA, comparing the prevalence across countries is not our priority. So this is why, for example, we do not rank countries according to prevalence. We rank them according to research productivity. We present like a classification of policy, the one that Deborah presented. We judge them in terms of having a plan or not, having surveillance or not, but we do not provide any judgment on the prevalence of inactivity. And the reason is that in addition to the standardization problem, we also have the fact that countries can use their own estimates if those estimates will fill our criteria. So I think that for the cards per se, which are meant to be used in that specific country, comparability is not the main issue, but obviously for when we want to scientifically compare countries, then comparability becomes a big issue. And several of the articles on these fields try to understand, and Sylvia obviously is aware of all of them. So I would say that for the cards, it's less of a problem than for scientific publications, in my view.
Okay, thanks, Adrian and Pedrinho. And we are at the end of our time. So I want to once again thank all of our presenters and panelists and the participants for being part of this, and remind everyone that GoPA is about both good science and the goodwill of the people who participate in this. And I really want to commend all of the research groups which developed indicators, and not only have they been used in country cards, but as you saw in the presentations, they are good science. They've led to peer-reviewed publications. And finally say, GoPA is a work in progress. There are flaws in all of these indicators. The second set of country cards advanced substantially over the first, and the third set will be both better and somewhat different from the second set, because science is dynamic and we're relying on the goodwill of a very good group of people who are pushing this effort forward. So thanks again for everybody. And as others have said, it's a real pleasure to work with the Global Observatory and everyone involved with it. And I turn it over for any last words to our organizers, Andrea and Tepi.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this webinar. We will plan more events like this. Thank you to our country contacts for always supporting GoPA. The slides and the video and the recording will be available for you soon, so you can use it with your contacts and with your students and with your networks. Thank you to all the speakers and to our discussants. Thank you also, ISPA, for the support in this webinar and in the communications of the GoPA projects. Thank you so much, everyone.